Hello, everyone. Welcome to you all. From Greenland to Japan, that's the geographic area that you as participants in this webinar cover. And from the list of participants, my impression is that you come from a range of backgrounds. To name a few, you are teachers, civil servants, students, pedagogues, and researchers, and a number of other things. So first, whoever you are and wherever you are, thank you for tuning in. Welcome. My name is Jakob, and I'm the host, and I'm one of the organizers of this webinar series, of which the present webinar is the second. The other organizers are Stina Sjöblom of Tampere University and my colleague here at VIVE.DK. We organize these events with financial, organizational, and academic support from the Nordic Welfare Center. Basically, the Nordic Welfare Center has given us some funds and a good long time frame, 2.5 years, in which to organize several webinars. Plus, they also provided us with a strong network of practitioners and scholars to get input from. So thank you to the Nordic Welfare Center. And do check out their website if you're curious about events like this. I'll say a little about the aim of the webinar series and briefly introduce our speakers and panelists today. So first, the aim of the webinar series. There is a strong tradition in the Nordic countries of looking to each other for experiences, perspectives, and inspiration for developing policy. That's also the case for policy regarding people with disabilities, where the countries share a lot of values that guide policy. So the aim of the webinar series is to follow in this tradition. It's to complement existing and long-running Nordic initiatives within as well as outside of the Nordic Welfare Center, with a particular focus on highly specialized services and service needs. Secondly, it's to facilitate sharing of knowledge and experiences concerning disability research and practice. And we aim to do this both at the national and the regional and the municipal levels. Finally, it's to integrate perspectives of users of disability services, practitioners within services for people with disabilities, as well as researchers. We plan to achieve these aims by having webinars on a particular topic, generally with presentation by researchers, which are then discussed by a panel representing different countries and types of practitioners. So today's webinar is about equal right to education. The right to education is important for everybody, as your access to education affects both your ability to get a job, to contribute to solving tasks in society, and to function as a citizen in a democratic society. The right to education is also important at many levels, from primary schools to training in the workplace to university education. Here today, we focus on primary schools. That is, we focus on efforts in primary schools, both ordinary and specialized schools, to secure children with disabilities equal right to education. We've asked 3 distinguished scholars, Eda, Øyvind, and Juho, to prepare talks within this broad topic. They've chosen their own focus and angle within this topic. I think some of you are familiar with the work that they've carried out, and we're in for a treat in any case. We've also asked 3 panelists, William, Hannah, and Henrik, to put questions and comments to the speakers. I'm not going to make a long introduction to either speakers or panelists, but just to say we're really happy that you will all take part. We think this format will give us a good dialogue between different countries and between research and practice. Finally, we also have text translators at the ready, Maya, Noah, and Lars, like last time. They do live translation along the way. We hope this will be helpful to both those who are present now and for people who tune in later. Actually, we're recording this, so you might see this later, or you might just send the link to someone if you think it's of interest to other people. Lastly, some practicalities. You as participants, you don't have access to speak here. That's a bit troublesome when you do this over the internet. But you're most welcome to use the chat function at leisure. So you can share thoughts or questions concerning the presentation. You can share information of activities or initiatives you think are relevant to others, and you can share feedback about the format. And please, you can also maybe use it with the clap emojis or stuff like that after the presentations. We can't hear you clapping, but that might be a way of using the chat function. We'll start the talks now in a bit, and then we'll have a break at 10 minutes past 2 Danish time. That's about an hour from now. We try to stick to the program. The program says I should stop talking now and then give the word to Juho. So everyone, heartfelt welcome from us, and over to you, Juho.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this event and to talk about this very important and diverse topic. So my name is Juho Honkasilta. I'm a university lecturer at the University of Helsinki in Finland. And the title of my presentation is The State of Inclusion in the State of Inclusion. So basically, Finland is somehow or somewhat gained a reputation as some sort of example country of inclusion in education. So I'm going to distract that image a little bit, like give a critical overview of from national policy level and national level, like how is inclusion as principled education practice? How is it conceptualized? How is it carried out? So that will be my point today. So this presentation here is based on a forthcoming book chapter, which I have written with my colleagues, Päivi Pihlaja and Henri Pesonen, and it will be published in a book called Disability in the Happiest Country in the World. The aim of this presentation, as well as the book chapter, is to provide critical overview of this ambiguous nature of inclusion in education at the national level. So the focus will be on basic education, which in Finland means from grades 1 to 9, ranging from ages 7 to 16. So this will be the focus. And the question is how inclusion as principled education practice, how is it formed in education policy, and how is it governed to be implemented in practice? So this presentation is based on the research synthesis. We have synthesized research on various fields of education, about inclusion, about special education in Finland, as well as Finnish policy documents. Let's start by conceptualizing a little bit what I mean about inclusion in education. And my conceptualization comes from the discipline of disability studies in education. So first of all, inclusion is an ongoing principled process. It's not an outcome. And this is something that seems to be misunderstood quite broadly in Finland. Like you can see media reports on inclusion failing, as if it would be an outcome that has finished already, as if in Finland we would already practice inclusion. It's a principled process. It's an ongoing process. It's never an outcome itself. When I talk about inclusion in education, so we also need to think of the value basis. So what are the values of inclusion? What should this principled practice be like heading towards? So first of all, the values are respecting and celebrating human diversity by denaturalizing normality, rejecting medical and psychological explanations of educational difficulties, and categorization of difference in order to provide support. Promote equality, equity, social participation, and sense of belonging, and remove barriers to learning and social participation. So this is the value basis that which we take now with us when we take a look at what's going on in Finland in policy level and how is inclusion conceptualized and implemented in practice. So the content of my presentation will be that I will first provide brief context of Finnish basic education, like a little bit, very briefly, the history, and briefly, where are we at this moment. So just to contextualize. Then I will talk about the ambivalence of inclusion as principled education practice. So I will start from policy level, then I will move on municipality level and school level, where these practice of or principle of inclusion is put into practice. And then I will lastly go to talk about this polarized stance of teachers who actually are implementing inclusion in education. I will make some concluding remarks, like what is the state of inclusion in Finland based on this approach that I have taken here. And then some outlook on the future, like what will happen in near future that is relevant for this presentation. So let's contextualize a little bit what has been going on in Finland and what is the status at this moment. So my main focus will be on 21st century reforms. But anyways, I will start from the beginning of our country independence. So the first Basic Education Act was made in 1921. So from 1921 to 1997, the progress towards inclusion has been basically from exclusion to segregation. So we could say at the system level that in 1997, education for all was established in Finland. This means that students with severe and profound intellectual disabilities were integrated into comprehensive education system, whereas before that they were within the social welfare system. So in 1997 onwards, we can say that at the system level, Finland has provided education for all. And it has been in two different settings, general education setting and special school setting. So this is what I mean when I say from exclusion to segregation. Up to 1997, education for all was provided in two separate settings, either in general education or special schools. And what I want to point out here also is that when we talk about the progress of inclusion in Finland, it is the progress of special education. Inclusion in education should not be regarded as special education agenda. It's not that. But in Finland, the progress towards inclusion in policy level, it is the progress of special education reforms. That's what in practice has happened. And in Finland, when you talk about inclusion in education, quite quickly the association goes into special education. Like, okay, now we are talking about the field of special education, the discipline of special education, and that should not be the case. Inclusion is not special education agenda. It should be for all educators and all teachers agenda. But this is the progress in Finland. Inclusion in education, progress towards inclusion is progress on special education. So in 1998, our current Basic Education Act was formed. And that was a step towards inclusion. Like then we are basically talking about segregation, integration, and inclusion. So our current Basic Education Act enabled full-time special education for students with disabilities in general education classes. So that would be or could be possible. The support was two-tiered support. So talking about general education and special education. And in order to receive special education support provisions, you needed to be, or like individual education plan needed to be formulated. So schools had to make a targeted, individualized plan how to support schooling within general education or in special education. It's also noteworthy that official diagnosis play no role in Finnish support system, and that has been from 2000s onwards. So this was the first round of like conceptualization, like what happened in Finnish policy, generally speaking, I mean, until 2010. So from exclusion to, well, let's say towards inclusion. In 2010, along with the special education reform in Finland, our two-tiered support system was changed into 3 tiers of support. So we are talking about general support, intensified support, and special support. The emphasis on this special education reform was to strengthen the principle of neighborhood schooling among same age peers, and to provide preventative, timely, and sufficient support for the learning and growth of all students. The idea was also to shift the responsibility of teaching heterogeneous student populations from special education to general education. And this reform hallmarked the Finnish child-centered approach to promoting inclusion in education. So now also this special education need discourse emerged in Finland. So basically this child-centered idea should be about assessing support needs in the local context of a student and then support that student. And that is now called a special education need or special need of a student. And well, I won't problematize that discourse in this presentation, but when you talk about special education need in light of inclusive education, it is kind of still stigmatizing. We talk about special education need students as if, well, we don't have time for that in this presentation, but you get the idea, I hope, that this is the idea of inclusion in education, and it's about special education needs, and that's not what inclusion in education should only be about. The problems with this current reform is that there is no normative description regarding what means of support should be given in each of these tiers, or how to decide whether students move upwards or downwards from these support tiers. So municipalities and schools, which have a lot of autonomy in Finland, they can interpret and apply this idea how they want. So as one example, drastic example, is that we have schools in Finland that have full-time tier 2 small groups, which should be illegal because you're not allowed to provide full-time small group teaching unless a student is in tier 3. So unless student have, you need to have individual educational plan for that student, and then you are like by law you are able to provide full-time small group teaching. So this is like drastic example like how municipalities and schools actually can implement and interpret this system as they wish. The last concept of this contextualizing what we are talking about in Finland when we talk about inclusion in education is the concept of demanding special support. So in 2015, this idea of demanding special support was conceptualized, and it was directed at schooling arrangements of students with severe mental health issues, multiple severe or intellectual disabilities, or autism spectrum. So the idea was that these 3 tiers of support that are mainly pedagogical support, they are not enough for providing inclusion in education for all students, because there are students who need interprofessional collaboration, interprofessional support for their schooling. So the idea was this concept, demanding special support, which will be changed in near future to demanding interprofessional support. So the idea was to conceptualize child-centered praxis provided in interprofessional collaboration. So it's not tied to any of these tiers, it should complement each of these tiers. And I have written there is VIP network. It's a network that is established by the Ministry of Education and Culture and Finnish National Agency, and is coordinated by the National Centre of Learning and Consulting. The idea of this VIP network is that at the moment, almost all of the Finnish municipalities are part of that network. And the name of the network comes basically from, it's a demanding special support network. So the idea was to establish a network in 2018 that would provide support for schools, like bring this interprofessional collaborative support for schools in the local schools, instead of taking students out from schools to special education or special school settings. So this was the idea. Problems at the moment with this conceptualization of demanding special support are that it is, to some extent, it's contradictory to non-diagnostic approach to providing support, because it targets to certain medical diagnosis or medical model diagnosis. It is not administrative, or there's no normative governance. So it's more or less confusing, because nobody at the moment knows what is demanding special support or demanding interprofessional support. Even if the network, this VIP network, is supposed to provide demanding interprofessional support or demanding special support, there's no consensus and understanding what does that actually mean. And this has been mistaken as a fourth support tier. So we would have general, intensified, special, and demanding special support. So it has been a bit confusing in Finland, like what is going on. But the idea is to bring interprofessional collaboration into general education. One point of this also is that whose voice is represented. Like if you think about the CRPD, they are talking about reasonable accommodations. And then in Finland, we are talking about demanding support. So how does reasonable accommodation become demanding? So this is the voice that is represented is not the voice of students with disabilities, not their families. It is the voice of these educational structures and support structures that we have in place. So the question is, like, when does interprofessional support, when does it become demanding, how and why? And of course, to some extent, it comes down to resources. So this is the contextualization, like what we are talking about in Finland, where we are at this moment. So I will now talk about the ambivalent nature of inclusion as principled education practice. I will first talk about the policy guidance, how is inclusion understood in education policy, and then how is it implemented in practice. So let's start with education policy. So in principle, Basic Education Act assumes values of inclusion. Like it talks about equality and equity as aims of basic education. It emphasizes the neighborhood school principle of basic education, and also promotes child-centered schooling to support healthy growth and development of all the students. But in Basic Education Act, there is no mentioning of inclusion at all. The whole word inclusion is missing. The neighborhood school principle could be understood as like neighborhood school preferably for all, because Basic Education Act also enables providing full-time special school education as being part of inclusion in education. So it's a preferable that all the students go to neighborhood schools, but it's not a demand. So basically, our Basic Education Act does not provide explicit guide about inclusion in education, and at the same time, it equates inclusion in education as special education need education. That's what it basically does. So then, national core curriculum, which all the municipalities, all the schools are implementing. into practice. There, the national core curriculum in Finland, it does entail principles of social inclusion. So there is emphasis on accessibility of teaching and accessibility of learning, emphasis on individualized supports and actually how to do that in education setting. And it emphasizes on school cultures built on values of equity, equality, anti-discrimination, participation, interdependency and reciprocity. At the same time, inclusion is only mentioned once in national core curriculum, and it's not conceptualized at all. So the only part where inclusion as a word is mentioned, it is a very broad, vague sentence that leaves everything open for interpretation. None of the content is linked to inclusion in the national core curriculum. And also, the core curriculum equates guiding principles of inclusion with integration and exclusion at the same time when talking about inclusion, or like directing towards social participation. So again, national core curriculum is very ambiguous about what is inclusion and how should that be governed, or how should that be implemented in practice. So in education policy level, there is also like this idea of like promoting, accepting, respecting diversity, but still disability seems to be like separate entity. For example, in national core curriculum, diversity is associated with cultural background, with language diversities. It's not, and disabilities, it's a known entity. This national core curriculum, it has very ableist premises. So it creates the valued pupil who can self-regulate, who is autonomous, who is active. So, and the role of community in which this valued participation should take place is weak. Then in national core curriculum, there's a scarce instruction, like how to differentiate teaching with students with disabilities. So it enables the dichotomy between general and special education, both as practice and as professionals or professions. And as I said, there's a silencing on disability. So diversity is language and cultural diversity. And this is the same has been going on in different education policy statements in Finland. So the trend is to reduce or omit content and guidance related to disabilities. So, and this is also like, this reflects into news media representation. Like in news media, inclusion is equated with special educational needs, and special educational needs are equated with cultural backgrounds and behavioral problems. And so we are talking about diversity, and then we have disability. So when we talk about inclusion in education policy level, disability is somewhat omitted. It's somewhat there in the background, like kind of like as it wouldn't be in the center of this conversation at all, and this governance at all. So ambivalences of inclusion as principled practice. So as I said, there's no guidance, there's no clear conceptualization and governance towards inclusive of values of inclusion in education. So I will use placement as one example that reflects the state of inclusion in Finland. When we talk about placement, like the idea of where students actually go to school, that does not mean a lot. It doesn't mean, because the placement doesn't distinguish between inclusion and physical integration. We can talk about physical integration. So we don't know what is actually happening. Even if schools with diverse support needs are within general education, we don't know whether the practices there actually are inclusive. So in 2021, we had around 60 special schools, and the number of special schools are going down all the time in Finland. At the same time, we don't know whether this is the fact that special schools are actually cancelled, or whether there's like administrative decision to blend or integrate with general education schools, but still having like complete separate practices. So in 2021, 9% of all students received this tier 3 support, this special support, and 1/3 of them were spent full-time, they're like full-time education in segregated setting, either on special schools or in separate small groups or classes in mainstream schooling. And another 1/3, 30%, received education part-time exclusionary in a part-time exclusionary setting. But this part-time can mean 20% or 80% in exclusionary setting. So there's a huge variance between those two. But this is like what is the state of this moment in terms of student placement. So how to interpret this? And I don't have a clear answer for this. I really don't. If we think of Salamanca Declaration, the Finnish way is kind of like in line with that, like education for all adapted to diverse individual circumstances. If we think about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD, the Article 24 states that disabilities are not to be excluded from general education, or people with disabilities not to be excluded from general education based on disability. So the question is like, now if we have students in special schools based on their disabilities, some of them are, so is this in line with the CRPD statement or not? Is this inclusion or not? If we think about that from our education policy, like a Basic Education Act, from that perspective, it is, because, well, first of all, inclusion is not mentioned there or conceptualized, but it directs towards this direction. So then if we talk about local leadership, there are diverse ways how inclusion is implemented in practice in schools. We have schools that actually implement the idea of inclusion. They reorganize and resource their practices accordingly. We have schools that practice physical integration by taking special, like small groups and special schools down, physically integrate students into general education without providing any resources for additional support. And then we have schools and municipalities that maintain the already established segregating special education practices. And when it comes to our local education departments, like head of our like municipality leaders responsible for education, they tend to regard their job as management. So they pass the leadership to individual schools. So the idea is that we are positive towards inclusion, but we don't know what actually should be, how it actually should be implemented. So then we talk about the teachers who actually implement inclusion in education. They, based on research, they seem to be very polarized. Like teachers, they feel unprepared for teaching students with intellectual disabilities, or like students who they associate with emotional and behavioral problems. And also they are critical towards the idea that whether they should, these grouping of students should actually even be within general education classes. And then teachers, when they support inclusion in education, they refer to pedagogical and resource factors. So basically the idea that this can be done if it's resourced accordingly and if you change pedagogies accordingly. And also they support inclusion in education because it is a student's right for equality and equity. At the same time, inclusion in education is opposed because of lack of resources and because of the idea that it violates a student's right for quality education. So basically what is talked about is how municipalities have interpreted inclusion and how they have resourced or not resourced inclusion. So some concluding remarks. This is clearly a vicious cycle. Like if legislation and policies don't explicitly conceptualize inclusion, they don't govern towards inclusion. So then municipalities, they have complete autonomy, and schools have autonomy to interpret and implement inclusion how they see fit. So there's clear lack of education policy governance and lack of willingness to lead towards inclusion in education as per the philosophical ideas and the values of inclusion in education. But again, I want to remind inclusion is it's a progress, it's a process. There is some sort of a paradox of inclusion in education in Finland. The idea seems to be that first of all, this current state of education, the status quo is resisted from top down and bottom up. At the same time, inclusion in education is resisted from both top down and bottom up, from policy level to teachers and so on. So there's this idea that we promote a sense of belonging among like group of students like who are deemed special. Among them, at the same time, we exclude them from social participation among peers that are deemed normal. So there's a lack of willingness and resourcing to go towards inclusion in that sense. But I promised in the end some promising outlook in the future. There will be, in our next Basic Education Act, this inclusion will be mentioned there, it will be conceptualized. We will see in the future how and with what ends. In national core curriculum, this will also happen. Like they will take better look at how should inclusion be conceptualized there. And also teacher training programs in universities in Finland, they are taking more serious about this idea that teachers should understand a little bit more about special education know-how so that they can implement, they can better support the diversity of support needs in our schools. And then about this VIP network, which was the idea of demanding support and demanding interprofessional support. It will have stronger role in the future. And in terms of going like progressing towards inclusion, like the idea of consulting and providing consultation and support for schooling and learning in collaboration with local schools, that seems like a correct way to do it. The question in future will be how it will be implemented in practice. I think I am run out of time, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Juho, and I think I'm one of the only participants who can actually be clapping, so I'll clap from here. Thank you very much, Juho, for starting today's event, and then we'll just go quickly over to you, Edda, and go crazy in the chat function with the claps and all. Thank you, and over to you, Edda.
Is this working? You see my slides? Okay, great. Thank you.
All good now, Edda. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah. So my name is Edda Óskarsdóttir. I'm going to talk to you about inclusive education in Iceland and the compulsory education or comprehensive basic, which is from 6 to 16 in Iceland. The status and the prospects. And basically, I'm going to discuss an audit that was performed on our system of inclusive education by the European agency and the following steps that we're taking afterwards. So the idea of inclusion has been implied in the Icelandic laws since 1995. Although declaring that pupils should be educated in an inclusive school was first explicit in the Icelandic Act for Basic Schools in 2008. Following this act, a new regulation for learners with special needs came out. And the change in emphasis here is that what that is visible is that it goes from emphasis on a medical diagnosis to an emphasis on the learning needs, or what the school can do to meet learner needs. Following this, in 2011, we got a new national curriculum, which is still in effect. And this one is based on 6 fundamental pillars for education. And those are literacy, sustainability, democracy and human rights, equality, health and welfare, and then creativity. And these fundamental pillars are grounded in an imperative to provide general education to all, to promote each individual's abilities to meet the challenges of life. The fundamental pillars are to be the basis of the education in all subjects. The focus is on building, the human being that is the outcome of going through schooling, more than the subjects that are taught in school. There is a chapter on inclusive education in the national curriculum, but there's no strong focus on how to differentiate or how to meet different needs. Except there's a very recent addition, which is focused on learners with different language backgrounds. According to this latest Act for Basic Schools, the second article, school practice should be in accordance with learners' needs and attainment, supporting their development, their well-being and education. And the 17th article, which is about learners with special needs, states that learners are entitled to be treated equally. Their educational needs are to be met in a common compulsory school without exclusion, without regard to their physical or mental abilities. And this is, these are the nice words. And then there may be some differences in how this is translated into practice. So even as the philosophy around inclusive education has developed within policy documents, and certain steps have been taken to follow it through, there have been doubts about whether the implementation is really inclusive at all levels. It is similar to what Johu has discussed here before, that in many places people are still talking about inclusion as special needs education. So it's not, it has not come through all the way. Because the policy is clear on the values and the emphasis, but it is less clear on how the practice should be, what pedagogy should be employed, how do we organize schooling to work on this. So there were several actions taken to analyze the situation because of this dissonance between what this policy states and what is actually happening in schools. First one was in 2014 when the OECD conducted a review of policies to improve the effectiveness of resource use in schools. Another one was in 2013 when a group from municipalities, the teacher union and the Ministry of Education together conducted an evaluation on of the implementation of the inclusive education policy. And they also performed a review of academic research in Iceland in connection to this. And the findings from these data show that it is nearly impossible to evaluate the implementation, especially at the municipality level. There's evidence that individual teachers and even schools are building on inclusive education, and this is just here and there, but not enough. So it was, the ministry decided that a further analysis was needed on the implementation and on practice. So the ministry brought in the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education to do an external audit of the Icelandic system for inclusive education. And it was agreed that the audit would cover pre-compulsory and upper secondary schools. Also, that it would be crucial to get active participation and engagement of school, local, and national level stakeholders. The audit had a wide geographical coverage, and participants from all regions in Iceland were involved in the main fieldwork activities, which were 27 focus groups, 11 school visits, and 9 one-to-one interviews. Just you have to take notice that Iceland has, well, at that time we had probably 350,000 people living in Iceland. And then they sent out an online survey for parents, teachers, support, and school leaders, and this had a national reach. And the participants in the focus group were also from different levels of the system and included parents and learners themselves. So before the audit took place, the team from the European Agency identified 7 areas or standards through a critical reflection of the current system for inclusive education. So the standards are here statements of what could be seen in inclusive school systems, and the text, and then there's text that shows the findings from the audit. So you see it here. So the text in the colored boxes are the standards, and the arrows have the findings. So for the first standard, inclusive education is defined by all stakeholders as an approach for improving the quality of education of all learners. The audit findings show that majority of school level participants and also parents agree that inclusive education is about the rights of learners and their families and should be about improving the quality of education. However, there is also a widespread agreement that greater clarity around the concept of inclusive education is required. So there's no common understanding of inclusive education. You could talk to 2 teachers who are teaching next to each other in a school, and they would have totally a different understanding of what it means. One would talk about equity and access, while the other one might talk about special needs specifically. For the second standard, legislation and policy for inclusive education has the goal of promoting equal opportunities for all learners. There's this main strength that came out of the audit, is that it is built on a strong foundation of legislation and policy. And this is in line with international conventions relating to the learner rights. There is a democratic approach to education that has broad support across all stakeholder groups in Iceland. However, there's a lack of guidance of how to implement the policy aims in practice, like I said before. The third one, policy for inclusive education, is effectively implemented at all levels. This, of course, needs much more work because the audit showed that the implementation had not been followed through. So there is a difference between schools and between areas in how the policy was implemented. And there's a call for the effectiveness of support system, funding mechanisms and governance, and quality assurance procedures. The fourth one, all stakeholders at all levels are enabled to think and act inclusively in their daily practice. The education system does not fully enable participants to think and act inclusively in their daily practice. The audit found that the physical environment of the majority of Icelandic schools is a strengths area. They are accessible and they are welcoming buildings. Also, there is a degree of freedom within the curriculum that has led to numerous examples of innovative and effective school development and practice in schools. There are, however, challenges in how inclusive education is interpreted and implemented within schools. And this is most difficult, I would say, or this This challenge is most visible in the upper secondary school level, where most of them are quite segregated. And there has been a relatively high dropout rate, although it is less now than it was 5 years ago when this was performed. So the fifth standard is about resource allocation, or money and other resources. If it's equitable, efficient, and cost effective. So the audit found that school funding is not equitable or efficient. In many municipalities, especially the larger ones, the funding has been based on the number of learners with diagnosis. This means that there has been a great call for diagnosis, because that will bring more funding to the school. So the funding processes were actually working against the policy of inclusion, with the emphasis on diagnosis instead of focusing on developing schools to be more able to work with all kinds of learners. The sixth standard, governance and quality assurance mechanisms, ensure coordinated and effective implementation of inclusive education policy and practice. Well, this is not effective, as it doesn't support or inform the work of stakeholders, and all the stakeholders, they do not view the current educational governance and quality assurance or the accountability processes as effective. And they also state that the quality assurance mechanisms do not always inform their work in a way that promotes school development and improvement. So there's a need for quality assurance of all of the stages in the system. So both at the ministry level, at the municipality level, school level, to check on if are we being inclusive, is what we are doing in the line of inclusive practices. So many school level, and the seventh one, the professional development issues at all levels, system levels, are effectively addressed. And many school level stakeholders question the degree to which their initial education, or so this is teachers talking about that their initial teacher education and their ongoing professional development opportunities prepare them for the realities of inclusive practice. Many national and local level stakeholders question how far these opportunities for professional development are aligned with national and local policies. So there might be opportunities for professional development, but they might not be supporting inclusive education or supporting inclusive practice. And then they're not supporting school staff to implement inclusive education as a rights-based approach for all learners. So based on these findings from the audit, 3 critical levers were highlighted as likely to have the greatest potential to develop the system. These levers are interconnected and mutually supportive. So they are focused on stakeholder debate on what inclusive education should look like in practice. An agreement on the second one is focused on an agreement of minimum levels of service provision to support inclusive education in all schools. And the third one is to review and rationalize the current resource allocation system. And so in response to this, to the audit, these actions have been followed. The ministry created a steering committee and they initiated a widespread discussion about inclusion. There was an investigation into how school system is resourced, and then to secure cross-ministry collaboration on the welfare of all children and youth. And I will go through these actions. So the steering committee to follow up on the audit was in effect from 2017 to 2019. And in the group, there were representatives from 3 ministries. So the Ministry of Education, of Health, and of Social Affairs, from the Association of Municipalities, from the Homeschool Parent Organization, from the Teacher Union, from the Rectors Association, and from the Teacher Education Universities. And this group discussed the findings from the audits and planned the next steps. The strength of the group was that the participants came from all these different stakeholder groups. This meant that the viewpoints of parents, teachers, school principals were heard, as well as from the municipalities and the ministry level. And this was the first time that these three ministries looked together at the education system and saw how they all had roles in connection to bringing up the children in Iceland. And the first action that the steering committee initiated was to organize meetings all around Iceland to discuss inclusive education. Altogether, there were 41 meetings in 18 communities around Iceland, and this took 3 months. In each place, there were 2 meetings. The first one was in the morning with representatives from the municipality, from the local health and social services, from the after-school programs, and the school services. And these meetings lasted about 2 hours, and the aim was to hear the concerns that the people had in different places around Iceland. What were their worries, and what did they see as strengths of the area? Examples that were mentioned were as the challenges were, for example, there were long distances for teachers to get to professional development, and it was expensive for them, you know, both to fly to Reykjavik and also for the school to have someone to substitute for people to go for a long time. There was lack of psychological support at the secondary school was also mentioned. Also examples of great solutions. For example, there was already in effect a strong cross-sectoral work in the Eastern Fjords in Iceland, where the social services, the health services, and the education system were working together to for children in need and their families. And so in the afternoon of these meetings, there was a bigger meeting with representatives from the schools in the area, so from preschool, compulsory, and upper secondary school, and from the local parents association. These meetings were in 2 parts. First, there were presentations from the teacher universities on inclusive education. There was a presentation from local teachers about their concerns and good examples of how they were working with inclusive practice. And then in the second part of the meeting, the participants took part in group work. The end product of the group work was a cairn, or a signpost, created by participants, where they listed important issues needed to address for developing the inclusive education system. The aim of the group work was to give participants the opportunity to consider what stood in the way of inclusive education. The groups discussed if schooling was characterized by inclusive education and found ways to remove obstacles or neutralize them. And at the same time, participants had to reflect on and coordinate their ideas about what the term inclusion means in practice and what kind of practices this called for. So this is a picture of one of the cairn, the final cairn that came out of the meeting, where we compiled all of the group work from all of these meetings around Iceland. And the top 6 items in this cairn are mentioned here on the slide. So these are the focus areas. We need the areas we need to focus on to break down the barriers to inclusion. And this is what the people mentioned. So it's about funding and it's about working conditions. And this was specially maybe mentioned for the preschools or, you know, the play school. In Iceland, it's called play school, where people have long working hours. There are not very many people who are educated preschool teachers, and there's a lot of work pressure and so on. And the second one was to do with collaboration, to strengthen collaboration within schools and within school and outside school, so towards services outside school and between the sectors, like we talked about before, and also to strengthen teamwork within schools or learning communities. Third one was the focus on teacher education and professional development to really scrutinize and look into what are we teaching in teacher education and how are we supporting teachers in professional development, how and also making it more accessible. The fourth one was about attitudes and beliefs to increase understanding of inclusive education, and also attitudes towards it, because we often, like Juho talked about earlier, we hear a lot in the media that everything that goes wrong in the school system is because we have inclusive education. There was just this week, we had a news item on increasing behavioral problems in schools and lack of resources to deal with that. And that's also because we have inclusive education. That's the reason. Well, and then we have support for teachers and consultations in schools and the focus on school services. So we need to increase access to this support and to consultation. And the sixth one is to clarify the vision of the aim and vision of what we want for schools. And also clarify who has responsibility for what in the implementation and in the practice itself. And this focus on, for example, what is the difference between being a teacher or a special needs teacher? What are your responsibilities? As a classroom teacher, you are supposed to be responsible for all the kids in your classroom. You're not supposed to be able to say that the special needs teacher is responsible for some of the kids in the class because you are not educated to teach them or something like that. So this is something we need to clarify. There was a project conducted on financing, and this project was a response to the result of the audit, of course, and also to the call from the stakeholder discussion. This project was carried out in collaboration between the Ministry of Education and Culture and 13 municipalities spread around the country. The aim of the project was, on one hand, to analyze the current criteria for funding, and on the other hand, to work with policy guidelines and a self-review tool for financing policy from the European agency, a project called FPICE. The purpose was to prepare guidelines and proposals for how to fund inclusive compulsory schools here. And the project conclusions, what there was a need to focus on how to we needed to review resource allocation to clarify the roles and responsibilities of different funding bodies, so the state and the municipalities. Explore different funding models that shift the resource allocation from focus away from individual learners. So we are not bringing in more money because we have more children with some kind of diagnosis, but we are bringing in money because we have all kinds of different, what do you say, like social identifiers within the school and catchment area. Then we need to explore different funding models that shift, I said that already, and existing approaches to propose ways forward. So, yeah, take it from where we are at now and how we can move forward to develop this system. An important outcome of the audit was a new act that was agreed in Parliament, Alþingi, last year. This act is the Act on Integration of Services, often called the Wellbeing of Children Act. And this would secure a cross-ministry collaboration on the welfare of all children and youth. And among other things, this act sets responsibility for adults in the child's immediate environment to respond to children's need for support. And then, so this includes that all children and their parents in need will be guaranteed access to a service contact that can provide guidance on how to apply for services and other support as needed. Also, it can be mentioned that our Ministry of Education is now called the Ministry of Children and Education, and that this is the focus of our minister. He was the one that carried out or brought forward this act and stood behind it. And he has a focus on how to look at the whole child, emphasizing mental health of children and youth. So then what are our prospects? We are now waiting for an education strategy 2030. The first action plan for this education strategy has been agreed in the Parliament. And all of the work that has been done in response to the audit was used in creating this strategy. And there are expectations that this education policy will contribute to further develop and strengthen inclusive education. However, there has been no funding for this so far, and this work is totally at the standstill at the ministry, in the ministry. So we might be getting to 2030 quickly and nothing has happened. There has been published a policy draft and guide for children, working with children and young people who have diverse linguistic backgrounds, and this was long overdue and very welcomed. There are some areas in good shape, as for example, the right for disabled students to attend their neighborhood schools. There are, however, problems in the system. There are long waiting lists for initial diagnosis of, for example, autism, for services for children with behavior and mental problems, and for children with speech impediments. These problems have various roots, such as lack of funding, lack of people with expertise, and also in some cases, there's too much emphasis on the specialist diagnosis or therapy, which could perhaps be better solved in schools. So the schools are still pushing away things that they should be able to work on better. And this brings us to the need to look at the teacher education, how teachers are prepared to accommodate to a diverse group of students and work in collaboration with others. There's also a need to look at what happens when young people graduate from comprehensive schools. What does the secondary schools do? How does it take responsibility, and what happens at the municipality level? University level. So we look at developing an inclusive school system as a journey with a goal, but it needs to be constantly reviewed and requires reflection, navel-gazing, open-mindedness, optimism, and what we think in terms of solutions. There are many signs where we are on the right track, but we need to be on our toes to make sure that we have our eyes on equity and the well-being of all in the system. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you, Edda. Fantastic. And please, everyone, keep it up in the chat function. It's really nice to have these expressions of appreciation there also. So just telegrams of clapping. That's very nice. Thank you. And wonderful, Ed, also that you drew some links to Juho's presentation. We hadn't planned that at all, but it was just wonderful. One more thing, Ed, there's in the Q&A function, there's a question for you. You can check that out maybe. But otherwise, I'll just say that science has proven that we need a break now. So we'll just have 10 minutes of break, rest your head, and then we'll get back and to have Øyvind's presentation. So thank you very much. Have a nice break, everyone. Okay, that was about 10 minutes of break for everybody. So we're back, and now it's just over to you, Øyvind. Thank you for coming, and we've been looking forward to it.
Thank you. Just try to share screen first here. All right. Hello, everyone. I am Associate Professor Øyvind Snipstad from Inland Norway University of Applied Sciences at Lillehammer in Norway. I wish to start by saying that I'm very grateful and humbled to be invited to hold a presentation for you all here today. You and Edda has already presented some critical perspectives on inclusive education and the difference between policy and practice. In this presentation, I will do something similar in a Norwegian context, where I will be discussing how the reality of inclusive education might look different depending on what level you are looking at it from. However, I will perhaps be focusing more on a conceptual or a theoretical level in my presentation. However, I hope some of you find this somewhat interesting and useful, what I'm about to talk about in this presentation. The title of my presentation is Inclusive Education in Norway, from Inclusive Policies to Marginalizing Practices. So it's implying that I will be focused both on the macro level, inclusion on a macro level, and what is actually going on inside the individual schools and on a classroom level in a Norwegian context. All right, so for this presentation, I was asked to discuss the following topic: equal right to education, inclusive schools, and the organization of individual support. And that is in Norway, I might add. First of all, I think this is an interesting topic. It promotes thinking of how we might create schools that benefits all children, both socially and educationally. It is based on diversity by referring to equality and rights. Additionally, there are also some implicit features hidden within how inclusion is phrased in this question. Using the phrasing inclusive schools suggests that our attention should be directed towards the context or structures that surrounds the pupil, in contrast to what might have been the case if the sentence were phrased differently. For example, if it stated how we best could include individual pupils in school. And based on this short, somewhat quasi-scientific analysis of the theme of this presentation, I will go on to discuss how this topic on the screen here holds up when discussed in light of a Norwegian context. And in this presentation, I will primarily be focusing on the following. Do we have an inclusive education in the Norwegian school system? And are the Norwegian educational system at present able to secure all pupils equal opportunities in schools, both socially and academically? And the answer to these questions also have consequences on how we think individual support in an educational context. Oh, sorry. There are multiple ways in which we could define and operationalize inclusion. The Norwegian educational researcher Peder Haug has made one such operationalization based on the Salamanca Declaration from 1994. He argues that inclusive education, he argues if inclusive education is the ambition, it needs to be applied on all levels within education, from a macro level, which represents a nation's policies, values, ideologies concerning education, to a micro level concerning the individual classroom, teacher, and student. Further, Haug argues that inclusion needs to have a broad perspective, implying that inclusion is a concept that concerns all children in school, not just certain identified groups. And I will return more on this later in the presentation. But first I want to start with Norway, because Norway is in fact a quite interesting case when it comes to the two different levels mentioned here, namely the macro and the micro level that I've just mentioned. Without exaggerating, one could argue that from the outside and on the micro level, Norway appears to have a lot of things figured out. We seem to have figured out democracy, we seem to have figured out human rights, and we seem to have figured out education and inclusion. And perhaps with the exception of the energy sector being one of the world's largest producers of oil and gas, we are often viewed as a nation that have figured things out. And on the many areas, this might be true. Compared to many other countries, we do not have much corruption. We have a liberal view towards freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of sexuality. And though it has been increasing in recent years, the social differences in Norway are small compared to many other countries. And we have a social safety net, the welfare state, that secures all citizens the right to equal health and care services, social support, and education, to mention a few. And regarding inclusion, we also have been viewed to having a pretty good track record. Where the remaining special schools for children and institutional care for adults with disability closed during the 1990s. But are everything good and well in Norway? And are things necessarily always as they appear on first glance? On a macro level, many things looks good and well regarding education and inclusion in Norway. As mentioned, we closed down our last special schools almost 30 years ago. All children are provided with an equal right to education, meaning that all children have the right to belong to their neighborhood school. They are entitled to an education that is inclusive, and every pupil has a right to individual and adapted education. And students who struggle or fail to meet the requirements of ordinary education has the right to receive special education. However, this again is on the macro level. In order to point at some of the issues that exists within the Norwegian educational system, we need to move our attention downwards towards the micro level and take a look at how national policies, ideologies, regulations, and more are applied in everyday practices in schools, meaning how schools approach concepts such as inclusion, equality, and individual support. Excuse me. And similar to many other countries, Norway has had this history of a segregated special school system, where children who were defined as incapable to learn were subjected to systematic exclusion from ordinary education and from their peers. It was not until 1975 that Norway received its first law on education that would encompass all children, both in special schools and in ordinary education. And the argument behind what will later become known as the integration policies in Norway were largely founded upon the principle of normalization, which was ingrained in the Nordic approach to disabilities. Normalization, in short, states that all children should have access to normalized living conditions. For children with disabilities, this meant being provided with opportunities to live a life that resembled the life that their non-disabled peers lived. And the previous Norwegian special schools, as they were often boarding schools, meaning that students attending these schools would spend the majority of the year away from family and their local environment, in addition to those students belonging to special schools often having little to no interaction with the outside world, strongly suggested that such educational arrangement did not meet the defined principles of normalization. Meaning that special schools did not provide a life that resembled the life of others. And eventually it was decided that the state-run special schools in Norway were to be closed down, and all children should be integrated into the context of their local ordinary school. So the integration reform had succeeded. However, the story did not end there. Once the state-run special schools were closed down and all children now had the right to belong to their local schools, some issues concerning integration started to emerge. Some argue that integration required someone to be excluded in order to function as intended. The intention behind integration, that many of you might already be familiar with, was to provide people with, or pupils or people with disability, access to the similar social and educational fellowships as others. However, in retrospect, it may appear that integration only partially succeeded. Managing to physically integrate pupils from the now closed special schools into the ordinary schools, well, even this is also debated, but failing to secure the social and academic rights communicated through integration once they were physically located in the same building as their non-disabled peers. A couple of years ago, I attended a lecture from a colleague, Jonathan Ricks, a professor of participation and learning support at the Open University in the UK, where he made this drawing, which I see is similar to what Juho had in his presentation. However, you can find this drawing also in his book from 2015, which you can see the reference to that at the bottom right. But anyway, this drawing illustrates, or at least he tried to illustrate the difference between integration and inclusion, which can help us understand some of the issues that arose with the integration concept after special schools were closed down during the 90s. Along with Peder Haug, who I mentioned on the previous slide, Ricks argued that the common issue that emerged with integration was that very little attention was provided to what should happen to the pupils once they have been placed under the same roof as others in ordinary school. Even though they geographically were located in the same place, they often were placed in contexts that were physically separated from ordinary education. And they often received teaching and teaching material that bore little resemblance to the ordinary curriculum. And this is in Norway perhaps best exemplified through the extended use of the individual subject curriculum we see being applied in the Norwegian educational system to this day. Little attention was given to the structure or context surrounding the pupils, and in most cases and in most schools it was just business as usual. And that meant that you had the pupils with in ordinary education doing their things, and what would become the misconception of integration, the integrated pupils doing their own thing with little to no intersection between the two. Hence, Haug argues that special schools did not cease to exist in Norway, it just continued under the cover of an integrated school system. So what I have attempted to illustrate with the models or the drawings on this slide is that the issue with integration was that very little seemed to be done with the established structures in the ordinary education, despite of the new student group that had arrived. And this brings me to the current principle in education, which is inclusion, where one can argue that the intention with inclusion was to encompass the variety of all learners, implying more flexible structures which welcomes all regardless of disability, social background, language, religion, and sexuality, and so on. Much of the development that has shaped the Norwegian educational context is perhaps familiar to many of you. Norway is in no way unique in regards to failing to realize the full potential embedded in the integration concept. And this was partly reflected through the Salamanca process in the mid-90s, where inclusion would become the new principle that would secure the right for equality in education going forward. The emphasis on inclusion were, as the title of this lecture suggests, placed on the context, meaning the conditions surrounding the child, such as how the school should become physically accessible for all students regardless of background, how teaching should be organized to encompass the variety of learners, how schools should promote democracy and provide student right to affect their interests in education, and how schools could and should facilitate for social participation in meaningful social fellowships with others, and ensure that all pupils reach their potential both socially and academically. However, this was, of course, no easy task. Education in Norway and elsewhere is a place where a variety of different interests intersect. On one hand, there are neoliberal perspectives that values competition, individualization, and more. And on the other hand, there are social justice perspectives where equality, participation, democracy are the main concern. And this mounts to a complicated reality where it is often up to the individual schools and the individual teacher to find ways to complement these two often opposing views on education. And this brings me to the core argument I wish to discuss in this lecture, namely how our world, or in this case, meaning the educational system, might look different depending on what level you analyze it from. On the screen here, you see a model of inclusion that I have borrowed from Peder Haug. Among other things, this model is based on some of the core principles of inclusion as they were formulated in the Salamanca statement. In this model, Peder Haug has operationalized inclusion into 4 horizontal and vertical dimensions. Regarding the horizontal dimensions, these refers to what Haug views as the core values of inclusion and that should be reflected in inclusive education. And these are fellowship, participation, democracy, and benefit. The vertical dimensions of the model refers to the different levels that the educational system consists of. The upper one, or in some cases the upper 2, refers to a macro level, which is where ideologies, policies, regulations are developed and formalized as of the foundation for educational practices. The 2 lower dimensions of Haug's model refers to a micro level, which is the school, the classroom, and individual level. And it is at the micro level where schools and teachers are responsible to set the ideologies, policies, and regulations into life in practice. And ultimately, the practices are subjected to the individual child, which will in turn affect their experiences and behavior at school. Most studies, or at least studies that has been viewed as the most impactful, are studies on inclusion on a macro level, Macro studies enables us to draw general conclusions about nation's educational system and compare them to others. This has consequently placed studies concerned with micro level with a micro level focus in the background, where it has been debated whether it has any value for the educational system beyond the particular context that the micro study is conducted. And with the critique often being how and in what way could research focusing on one or a handful of schools provide any knowledge that have any relevance to the educational system as a whole. Together with a colleague, Professor Rune Haugstetter at Inland Norway University, we published an article earlier this year where we discussed the value of conducting micro-studies on inclusion. Though we argue that there are pitfalls concerning micro-studies on inclusion, they also have the potential to provide knowledge of great value. Only by studying what is in fact going on within the school institution, in the individual classroom, between teachers and pupils, and within the peer-to-peer interaction, can we get insight into how macro-level processes, such as formulated ideologies, regulations, policies, different interests, and so on, affect classroom practices and pupils as individuals on a micro level. Earlier in this presentation, I mentioned that on a macro level, things does not look all that bad for inclusive education in Norway. However, when turning our attention inwards on what is actually going on in municipalities, in schools, and in classrooms, and ultimately the consequences different approaches to education and special education have on pupils in schools, our glossy picture of the Norwegian educational system start to display some cracks. For example, we know that there's an increasing amount of children being diagnosed with learning or behavior difficulties in Norwegian school today than was the case a couple of years ago. The amount of pupils who are receiving segregated special education outside the classroom is also on the rise. There is a large amount of underqualified staff working within special education in Norway today, and we have over the course of the last 10-15 years or so seen an increase in special schools despite the integration reforms during the 90s. Though this is of course an interesting development in its own right, I would argue that it is equally interesting to know how this affects the pupils who are at the receiving end of macro-level processes in the Norwegian educational system. How, for example, does the increased use of segregated educational practices affect individuals' sense of self, their identity, how they view themselves as members of education and society, and how they are viewed by their social surroundings, such as peers, teachers, and so on. I would argue that in the current educational field, and in the discussion on whether we need more or less ways to identify difficulties or whether or not we need more or less segregated special education, studying those who are affected by macro-level political decisions, I think, may contribute to immensely important perspectives to this debate. However, as Haugstetter and myself argue in our article, whether or not the macro-level perspective can be legitimized on a macro level is a matter of direction, as I've tried to illustrate on the screen here. Rather than to seek legitimacy of individuals' experiences on a macro level, which could be both many and conflicting, and thus it would be unclear whether or not this is a relevant issue beyond the handful of cases studied, we argue that we may need to go the other way around. And look at applying accepted political decisions and educational ideologies to and direct that or take that as a point of departure towards a micro context in order to see the variations of how they shape classroom practices and individual pupils' behavior, experiences, and identities. And in my own PhD project, I attempted to do just that. And I want to use the remaining time to share with you some of my reflection, or some of the reflections from this project. There are a couple of reasons why it is difficult to say for certain what effects segregation and exclusion have on children and youth in education. One reason relates to what I problematized earlier, that studies directed towards a micro level processes, studies a small group of children, teaching or classroom practices, tend to have trouble providing general conclusions on a macro level. Another issue, as I have discussed in my own previous work and articles, relates to what the Canadian philosopher Ian Hacking refers to as the looping effect of humankinds. I have made an illustration here on how that looping effect might look like on the screen, and I'll try to briefly explain this to you now. So first of all, imagine a child with intellectual disability. Here we have two different phenomena. We have the organism, which is the human that we label as a child with intellectual disability. And we have the label or category itself, whose function is to describe the object or organism that we direct our attention to. In order to make the argument here clearer, let's for now just exclude the category child from this example and just keep the label intellectual disability. Okay, so we have an object. Upon this object, we place a category. In this case, the category intellectual disability. Intellectual disability is, however, just not just a name. It contains a whole range of produced knowledge, assumptions, values, norms, and so on, that provides us with a conception of who the intellectual disabled person is. The knowledge, assumptions, values, norms, and so forth will further have consequences for practices in institutions, such as, for example, in schools. How we understand the person labeled as intellectually disabled will affect what we consider the right or wrong way to approach the person given a particular label. In Norway, there isn't a requirement for a child to have a diagnosis in order to receive special education. However, children with intellectual disability, along with those classified with profound and multiple disabilities, are still the most likely to be met with segregated practices in the current Norwegian educational system, such as one-to-one teaching in small groups, or being placed in the increasing number of special schools that have emerged in Norway during the recent years. Okay, so, but moving on. Being labeled as intellectually disabled, followed by the knowledge and assumption in a broad sense implemented in the intellectual disability category, will affect how these people are approached in the institutions that they belong to. In turn, and according to Hacking, people will interact with the label that they are classified into, meaning that a person who are classified as intellectually disabled will interact with the category and the knowledge and practices following from this classification. And this will, according to Hacking, cause the person to change. And in Hacking's words, a new kind of person has emerged. What was earlier merely a person or a child has now become an intellectually disabled person or child. And from the model that you see on the screen, two potential alternatives can occur as a result of this. One is that the child or a person changes in accordance with the descriptions that the surrounding holds about the category intellectual disability. Or two, they can change into something else, something that our current descriptions does not include. And as a response to the latter, the category itself has to evolve or change in order to continue function as a descriptor for the object or the person that it's intended to classify. And thus we have a loop in Hacking's word. When new descriptions will bring about new knowledge, followed by new practices that will interact with the person in new ways, which yet again will cause a new kind of person to emerge that either adhere to existing descriptions or yet again changes to something else. Hacking, however, argues that this something else is impossible to predict. In order to illustrate why that is, we need to bring back the category child into the mix. Because no one, not me, not any of you, are just classified as solely one category at any given moment. For example, no one is solely intellectually disabled. They might also be a child, a son or a daughter, a boy or a girl, an athlete or a computer geek. All of which contains its very own sets of produced knowledge, assumptions, values, norms, and so on, and each subjected to its very own looping processes, which additionally also will be affected by intersectional processes between the different categories. However, as I have argued in some of my earlier work, there may be one potential way to make some general statements on how children with disability change on a micro level that might also be relevant towards a macro level. And that is by applying the phrase acting under description, meaning in this context that we act based on the actions available to us. If a child with intellectual disability are entirely subjected to practices that deviates from the practices of his or her peers, for example, that hers or his education is solely based on segregated practices such as one-to-one teaching or being located in special schools, the descriptions from where this child can act will most certainly be of a deviant kind. Without access to, or perhaps not being familiar with, ordinary education and the descriptions existing there, it would be difficult to act in accordance with what we could define as normalized description along the lines as I mentioned normalization earlier. And if we return to the looping effect and look at the interaction between the category intellectual disability and the person classified as such, one could argue that it's very unlikely that the new kind of person that emerged would change in ways that resembles the change that pupils in ordinary classroom go through. Though we cannot, as mentioned, exactly predict what kind of person that emerged based on the previously mentioned looping effect, we could arguably make the suggestion that if a child is viewed and treated as a deviant from his or her peers, chances are that the new kind of person that emerge will be a new kind of deviant child. The title of this presentation was Inclusive Education in Norway, Inclusive Policies and Marginalizing Practices. Some issues concerning the Norwegian educational system is visible on a macro scale, such as the increasing number of special schools, the large amount of qualified assistants teaching in special education, and the increased tendency to diagnose children in Norway. However, whether identification of difficulties among pupils or the use of special schools are viewed as problematic or not are subjected to ongoing debate in the field of education in Norway. For example, we see the term inclusion being used both for pupils in the school system as a whole and also as a concept applied within a special school setting. However, it is in this debate that we, also me and Rune Haugstetter, argue that the microanalysis of inclusion and special education play an important role, meaning what kind of children are we creating in the different educational arrangement. And this leading me to the conclusion in this presentation, which is not an answer to anything, but more of a question for reflection. And that is, do we provide equal opportunities for children through a special school system or a specialized and individualized educational provision? Or do we, through restricting them from acting under normalized description, construct a barrier that hinders some children from equal opportunities to participate in fellowships with others at present and from becoming an active member of society in the future? Thank you.
And thank you very much, Øyvind. Bravo. That was a wonderful perspective, both presenting the Norwegian experience and giving some philosophical perspective to the issues. You touched on some of the similar tensions to what Edda and Juho presented, but also some different institutional solutions and this different institutional context. That was very interesting. Now we move to the panel, which is, we have a panel that represents all you participants today. They are William, Hannah, and Henrik, who've been asked to reflect a bit on from their own background and experience, their perspective, and put questions, give reflections to the presenters. So we'll have them 3 in a row in a little bit. First, and then we'll have the presenters responding. So first the 3 panelists, and we'll start with William, and then move on to Hannah, and then Henrik. So over to you, William.
Thank you very much. And as said, my name is William. I am 23 years old and I suffer from muscular dystrophy. On the side of that, I am also studying to be a school teacher, and I have a specialty in special education. So in my time in school, I use a lot of my resources to look down in these definitions, and I'm quite focused on the question of inclusion. I feel like you've been saying some very, very interesting things, and you have started some reflections in my head, and I have some questions. I think I'll try just firing them off, and we'll see how much time there is in the end to actually answer them. First of all, I feel like there isn't any totally clear definition of what inclusion is and how we include children in classrooms or in educational fellowships. But I'm not quite sure, is it a good thing that there isn't a clear definition, or is it a bad thing? I can see some good things and bad things in both of the complexes, because sometimes it's good that the professional using these inclusional tools, it's good that he has some freedom to do what's necessary for the children with disability. But sometimes it's also weakening the quality of the tools the teacher can use if he doesn't know exactly what inclusion is, and if his own definition is, what can you say, diverse from the general definition of diversity in the school, of inclusion in the school, sorry. And then I have one other question too, and I'll throw the curveball at you afterwards. It is, I feel like many teachers are mixing the two words integration and inclusion. I perfectly well know what the difference is between inclusion and integration, but my opinion is that many teachers who have been in their profession for a long time have a hard time of separating these two words. So how important is it that we start educational know-how in the difference between these two words? I think I'll start at that.
That's brilliant, William. Thank you very much. Over to you, Hannah.
Okay. Hello to everybody. I'm Hanna Lampi, and I'm now working here in Helsinki University, but I used to be a teacher in Helsinki many years, and then like 4 years I have been working as a consulting teacher in VIVE.DK, which is the Center for Learning and Consulting in Finland, governmental company, and Juho was mentioning about that also with his slides. But I have plenty of questions in my mind. It was first of all very, very interesting to hear all of you, and I think there were so many things in common. Like I think maybe not in Norway you didn't mention the media so strictly than Finland, and Iceland probably has that kind of case that we have really split opinions. And I think the problem, like Juho said, in Finland is that it's very polarized discussion, and people are thinking that opposite of inclusion is segregacy, and I think it's not. It's more about like opposite for inclusion is of course exclusion, discrimination, bullying, teasing, all these kind of things. That's the opposite of that. Not it's too small like a view if we are talking just the school groups or something like that. It's more. But okay, for that sense, I had a colleague in inclusive model, and she was saying that special education is not a space science, it's an attitude. And my question for you is that how do you feel that sentence? Is the special education an attitude? And then another question I have, because I could just talk about inclusive and co-teaching. That's my solution for how we could organize this, the most important job in the world. And I think generally like inclusion is something that nobody is alone. No teachers, no students, nobody is alone. And I have my own experiences about co-teaching, that it really helps for so many different kind of things. So I would like to hear about Norway and Iceland, that how big role is the co-teaching in your conversations, because I think in Finland at least, like if you are reading the media, there's not that, sometimes there's positive articles about some system which work, and I think there's always co-teaching model in that, but then it's not like the way how we are developing generally. Of course, cities are like they are educating teachers for that, but it's not a big topic generally. I think we should talk about more about that. Those 2 questions first. I have plenty of more if we need.
Thank you, Hannah. Then we'll go on in this round to you, Henrik.
Hello to all. I am Henrik Lagerberg. I am a chairman of a non-governmental organization on Åland, and we organize different organizations with people with different kinds of disabilities. My first question is, should the education system adjust to the student, or should the student adjust to the system? This is the first question, because talking about inclusion, inclusion is a nice thought, of course, but what is needed to fulfill this goal of inclusion? What are needed? Which tools are we forced to have to reach this goal? Because, for example, one student is in a general classroom with a general teaching program, and but I ask, why is not the children in this classroom? No, he's sitting in another classroom with a school assistant. And how long has he been sitting there? Yeah, for 1 year. Is this inclusion or not? But this type of problems, we are in common. The thought of inclusion, we have not succeeded yet to fulfill the goal of inclusion for up to 100%. So, but this is the question: what is needed then to fulfill this goal of inclusion?
Thank you very much, Henrik. We'll have a second round in a little bit. For now, we'll just go over to the speakers. First, to Edda, who has a very important teaching obligation in a little bit. So you get to respond first, Edda. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for letting me go first. So I get this opportunity, and thank you for those good questions. Really, really important questions, all of them. So I think for the first question from William, I'm wondering about this, if it's a good or bad thing that the definition of inclusion is unclear. I think we need to always think about that the definition and understanding of inclusion is developing as we are developing our practices, because we get new students, new kind of situations in school. So we always need to rethink: are we doing this right? Are we including everyone? Are we doing it in the way that is equitable and respectful towards the students? I think, in a sense, that it is important that we have a similar understanding of what inclusive education, what the ideology behind it means, what it calls for. So I think that's an important base that we need to stand on, so that we don't have people in schools understanding inclusion as being special needs education. So that we are all thinking that inclusive education means quality education for all students, in an equitable way, and sometimes this means that a student needs to be in a different place than his class, but the basic line should be that he has the right to be with his peers. So that's the basic thing. Your second question about mixing integration and inclusion, I think that links really well to this question about the understanding about what is inclusion, what does it mean? Because integration was kind of the step where we are moving away from it, because integration meant that disabled students or students with all kinds of needs were allowed to be in the school, but it didn't mean that we needed to give them quality of education. We just need to, do something. So they were there. But when we are thinking about inclusive education, we have to think about the whole thing. We have to think about how are we meeting the student and what is happening in the school. So the student is belonging to the school. He is showing, some kind of, what you say, like, he has opportunities to show that he is successful and so on. So he's a part of the school as a whole. Then we have the questions from Hannah about special education as an attitude, or what was the other thing? What did you say?
Yeah, it was a colleague of mine was saying that special education is not the space science. It's more an attitude.
Ah, right.
I like it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we used to say when I worked in a school and I was a special needs teacher, and I was also later a coordinator or a director for special needs support in my school. And I actually did my EdD research, or educational doctorate research, on that. And we used to say that a special needs education is not a place. So it's not a room. It's something that goes from room to room where the need is, actually.
Yeah.
And so that was what we were trying to get people to understand, that the support that children need is not based in one room. It's supposed to be everywhere around, and it can also be in the teacher himself, in the way that he organizes his pedagogy and his teaching practices.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what we were thinking. And that comes also to the role of co-teaching, which I think, like you say, I think it's one of the maybe most important, yeah, I think it's one of the most important things that we can do in schools, is to emphasize co-teaching and co-working and creating this synergy between people, so that it meeting different needs of students is not about going to a different room or getting expertise, but for the adults to talk together and finding out, how can we do this best? Can I take a smaller group here and you take the bigger group? Or, can I learn something from you because you have encountered this problem before? Or, so I think the solution lies a lot in the discussion and in collaboration. And it has to be collaboration within school, but also with expertise outside of school, or people who have experiences, parents as well, and of course, listening to the students themselves, that's very important too. And people who have experience of being in this place, being a disabled student in a school, what are their experiences? So I think that's important. Henrik, you ask if the student should adjust to the system, or the system should adjust to the student. I think definitely we need to think about how we can adjust the system to the student. Of course, schools are very difficult to change because they are very, what do you say, reluctant. They're slow to change. So, but I think we need to think about for each student, how can we accommodate so that this student is feeling well in school, is adjusted, is belonging, is taking part. And this might mean that we need to make some changes in how we organize the timetable in the school. This might need that this class needs to be in a different classroom so that this student can take part because there are no steps or something like that. So I think we need to think about more breaking out of this. The system is controlling everything. What can we do to change so that the student, the system fits the student actually? And what is needed to fill the goal? Oh my goodness, there are so many things, of course. I think the first thing is that you need to be optimistic. You need to be, believe that we can have a school that can accommodate to all kinds of students. That's the first step. And then, not break down when everything doesn't work like you thought it would be. And then get people to work together on this and think in solutions. Think, what can I do? Because I'm part of the system and I have to do something. I can't expect that someone in the municipality or someone in the government or someone else is doing those things. I have to be the first step as well. What can I do? As a teacher, as a parent, as a student even, to make this happen. But there are, and so many of those things that we have discussed here today are the steps that we can take towards this goal. And but there are many factors, both from the outer layer of the system and then all the way to the inner layer of the system, where next to the students. So I hope this has put something into it, the discussion.
You should
Thank
imagine also that it. Thank you, Edda. That it is sort of picking up a briefcase and on her way to teach a class and so on. But
yeah,
thank you very much.
So I will go now,
for
and
your
thank you for today.
And
okay.
Øyvind and Juho, you will have a little bit longer time within the remaining 18 minutes of our time together. So thank you very much, Edda.
Yep.
See you next time.
Okay.
And over
Thank
to you, Øyvind, for responses. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. If it's all right, would like to answer multiple of the questions together, if that's okay, because I think it's
Within 3 minutes, shall we say that?
yeah, because much of what has been many of the questions that have been asked really relates to similar things, because someone asked if it's a method or process, if it should be an attitude or a space, if inclusion should have a final goal, what is the final goal of inclusion? I think also, and this is part of the debate within the inclusion concept, is whether, and I think you were also talking about that in your presentation. I think there are dangers if we view inclusion as some sort of final goal, or if we reduce it to some kind of concrete method of doing teaching. And there was also a question here. I think it was you, William, who asked whether or not it's important to learn about the difference between integration and inclusion. And in relation to what inclusion is, I think it's very important, because I think integration serves as a good example of what may happen if we reduce a concept to some sort of method. Integration intentionally was, quite socially oriented. It was about equality and democracy and, creating fellowships, but it ended up as kind of a misconception, where integration was reduced to a question of placement, and thus it became something that defined difference instead of being something that would create the fellowships between children, in this case, if we are talking about schools. So yeah, I think my 3 minutes are probably out soon, but I think if inclusion is not to have the same faith as integration had, I think we need to think of inclusion as a value, as an ideology, as a process, something that needs to be incorporated on all levels in education, from policymakers down to teaching individual teachers how to think inclusion. So I think it has to be embedded on all levels in education, and as a process and as a value, more than a method.
Thank you very much, Øyvind. And then over to you, Juho, and after Juho, we go back to the panelists for another round. Thank you.
Do I have anything to add anymore? I think I will answer all the 3 questions kind of at the same time. Like, we cannot talk about inclusion without talking about the philosophy of inclusion. We're talking about it as an ideology, because education is not ideology free. Segregation is ideology. Integration is ideology. And the fact is that all the Nordic countries have committed to inclusion. So and accept that as a human right. So then it's, from this perspective, it's when we talk about, we cannot talk about inclusion as an end goal. It's a process to make sure that these human rights actually are implemented and happen. And then in order to do that, we need to talk about the philosophy and the ideology of inclusion, which are these accepting and respecting diversity. So it's the values. So then I go to this integration and inclusion. We talk about integration as like physical integration, social integration. The idea of integration gets its meaning to, like, in terms of segregation. And that goes to special education. Like, as a discipline, historically, special education arose to identify differences in order to accommodate differences, in order to treat differences, to normalize people. So basically, historically, the idea was to go into Henrik's question, so that the student can fit into the system, not the other way around. The idea of inclusion came from disability movements to resist that idea that we don't need to be treated to the system. We don't need to be accommodated to the system. The system needs to change. So in this sense, I'm going everywhere, but I'm trying to wrap up all the questions. So the idea of special education is an attitude. I understand what it means. I kind of accept it. At the same time, I don't like it, because special education as practice, as disciplines, has structured the way we organize education. And it still structures the way we think about education, how we think about differences between human beings, and how we face them, how we react to them. So inclusion in education we should be able to talk about quality education without talking about inclusion. That's the premise of inclusion in education. When we talk about inclusive schools or inclusive groups, we are not even close to the process of inclusion, because then we make a difference between special or like regular and inclusion. And then inclusion or inclusive school is something that it's not the regular schooling or group, it's not special, it takes them both together. We should be able to talk about quality education, which goes towards the values and principles of inclusion. That should be the goal. That should be what we talk about. And then within that, there comes different ways of accommodating supports within school. That goes without saying, because we are not all the same. We have a varying, need for varying means of support in our everyday lives. So without answering to any question, and at the same time trying to answer all the questions, we should, maybe one day in the future, we don't talk about inclusive education anymore. We talk about education for all directed towards the values of inclusion.
Thank you very much, Juho. I think there are 10 minutes to go, and we have to finish at 3:30 Danish time, but we'll have space for just a few more reflections from the panel first, and a few final words from Øyvind and Juho. So first again, William, then Hannah, and then Henrik. Thank you.
Thank you. And how these different perspectives are so interesting, especially for me as a soon-to-be teacher, how to try to do my best to be an inclusive teacher in all means necessary. But I think we are, in this modern age, we are becoming better and better and better in speaking about our special needs. You see a youth being very, very open about putting their feelings into words, a lot better than my grandfather is, for an example. So because we're talking about all these special needs and talking about the differences, it's also becoming more and more important that we are very careful about how we talk about things. I see many teachers trying to include a child into his educational fellowship, but because he's talking so much about the differences of this child, he ends up stigmatizing this child and its special needs. So all his fellow students knows, okay, there's something wrong with this child or kid. So how do we go past that? Yeah, hard question, but let's try.
Great. And Hannah, a brief question from you again, or reflection?
Yeah, thank you for all. Yeah, I was thinking of the professional, like what is the special education professional, and thank you for Juho for answering about that perfectly. I think, but I at the same time I think we are so far away from that that we are not talking about inclusive in Finnish schools. I need to admit, because there's so many teachers who are like saying that I'm not professional for these kids, and they are saying that they are really they are classroom teachers or subject teachers, and they are thinking that okay, special education is something like that. Then it's miracle, and then you don't have problems anymore when you have that education or something. And that's something that we should like talk about, like about that attitude that you cannot send them away, and there is no place where those things like we do have a problems in and not the problems. We should think that all these diversities are richness, like you said. But maybe my reflection is one word what I have been falling in love for a couple of weeks ago. It's called unidiversity. And I don't find a Finnish word for that, but I think it's very good word for meaning that that's very universal, that we are diversity, that we all are diversity. And I think that's you will find if you Google that word, there is even unidiversity university already. But I think that's something what is, we have so many things in common, and that's something that we are diversity. Yeah, I don't have question anymore, but that was my.
That's great, Hanna. Thank you. And then Henrik, for your final remarks for today.
Yes, I'll try and follow up the primary school system with the secondary school system. And on our island, we have some people who disappear to nowhere. And this is a problem. They have been excluded out of the system. So it's a lot of challenges, but we have also a group of students who are not going to the school. We are staying in at home. So there are a lot of challenges, and we can't solve this problem today in this forum, but we must admit that we have challenges.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't think we're all done with the topic yet, but some final reflections and from you, Øyvind, and then Juho, and I think I'll cut it down at 3:30.
Yeah, no, I have a comment to Juho on integration. I also think that integration, as part of the problem with integration was, it required exclusion in order to make any sense. And I think, it was necessary to change perspective. But regarding integration, it was a concept that were put into placed in education in a completely different historical context, where special segregated, excluded special schools were the norm, and then you can debate whether or not it was good tackle that issue good enough, but still it was directed towards that system that we at least tried to move away from, and it became problematic once we had the integration reforms which in Norway was during the 90s. The question that William had, I think that is a difficult question to answer. How do we get past identifying children? I think perhaps we need to try to go beyond our tendency to be instrumental in relation to teaching, where we build our teaching and special teaching on the premise that we think that we can create or define groups of children and define how they will learn and what learning potential they have. I think perhaps what is also argued in inclusion, if we see it as a value and ideology, it encourages us to think education as something more flexible and something that's something that encourage creativity from the teachers. And yeah, so it's a difficult question, but I think we need to move past the descriptions that we have of education at present.
Can I take from that?
Yeah.
We need to move on from descriptions. At the same time, this idea, this special need is a description. Like the idea was with the discourse was like child-centered, and the idea like what does the child need? Like what support, what means of support do we need or the child needs? However, it has become a category of human beings again, like what Owen has talked about. Like this, we talk about children with special needs. That doesn't communicate us at all about the specific means of support that the child needs. It talks about there's a arbitrary category of difference called special needs, and children fall into that category. So the pedagogical language would focus on the actual means of support, not categorize a child or human being based on the arbitrary idea of special needs. So it is it's a problematic. Disability studies reject the idea of special needs. Disability studies, it's a special education discourse. It's not disability studies discourse. Disability studies talk about reasonable accommodation. So they focus on the means of support, not human categories.
And thank you, Juho. I think I have 30 seconds or something to wrap up. So I'll just say thank you very much for taking part from many parts of the world even, and from many backgrounds. It was great to have you all here. We are planning some more activities in this series, but I don't have time to mention them all, so you just have to check in on the website. Thank you all to the speakers and the panelists, and to you as participants out there, to text translators and communication specialists, everybody. Have a nice evening or night or whatever you're going into just now in the time zone you're in. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.